In November of 2008, Intel released the i7-920 CPU, the first of the new Core i7 series CPUs, which continues to the present day, and which ushered in a new era of performance, leaving the Core 2 line comfortably behind. It also, for a long time, displaced AMD from the competitive high-end performance segment, at least until March of 2017, when AMD launched the Ryzen line of CPUs and brought competitiveness back to the CPU marketplace. But this video is not about AMD versus Intel, and it's not about modern CPUs. Instead, this is story time with tech and a look back at the launch of the i7-920, which is what this is right here. I covered this computer in my home theater PC build. This will actually be linked to that playlist. I've owned this computer since new. It is over 10 years old at this point. It's one of the original Dell Studio XPS machines with an i7-920 in it, and it served many different roles for me over the years. It's pretty cool having a computer that, at least up until 2 weeks ago, I was actively still using. I may still use it for something else, but it's being retired as my media PC, as shown in the previous video. I have several computers on the desk here, and I'm going to talk about them, what role they played in my life, why I bought them, what functions they provided. I'm going to talk about the different CPUs that came out over the past 10 years in summary format, not in great detail, but instead the ones that meant something to me that I actually used, the relative pros and cons of each, why it's time to upgrade, a little more detail on why this is being replaced. And hopefully you guys sit back, relax, and maybe enjoy this story time with tech just a bit. If this video is well received, I can do more of these. I can go back to perhaps 1998 to 2008 and cover the computers I owned during that era, going from the Pentium 2s and 3s of the late 90s through the original AMD Athlon, the Athlon FX. Some of those processors were an amazing value. I personally skipped most of the early Pentium 4s because AMD was rocking it in the early 2000s until Core 2 came along. And then if there's still further interest, we can go back even further. Going from 1988 to maybe 1998, I had a 386, I had a 46DX266, I had a relatively rare CPU, the next gen 5x86, which was a limited time company because they ended up getting bought out by AMD, and that's a story for another video. And then we can talk about my Apple II and Apple II GS back in the 80s, but we'll see how this video does and whether or not you like it before we go and make any more. Linked in the video description below are going to be several links. First of all, the video on the i7-920 being replaced by a new home theater PC. If you're interested in seeing that, that'll be linked down there below. I've also done a variety of videos on both this Core 2 quad here and these machines, and those will be linked down in the description. So if you want to see more videos about older retro computers, then I will link those. Depending upon how much interest that gets, maybe I'll do further coverage on them. Otherwise, we might just stick to the new stuff. We'll see how it goes. Much like the Lord of the Rings trilogy and the first Star Wars trilogy, this is not the beginning or end of the story. We're starting in the middle. So, these are not the first or the last computers that I've ever owned. If you want to know the first computer I ever owned, that was in 1984. It was an Apple IIe with dual 5¼ floppy drives. It was the very cool Apple Duo that was mounted underneath the Apple RGB color monitor and above the actual Apple IIe itself. It was the original, not enhanced. There was no numeric keypad. It did have a 64K expansion card and the 80-column expansion card, and I was lucky enough to have an Epson FX85 9-pin near letter quality dot matrix printer, which was very cool in 1984. Ridiculous today, but you know, it was what it was. How about that? That'll all be covered in another video. We're not going to talk about that history today. We're going to start today's history with this computer. This I have also owned since new. This is a Dell Core 2 Quad Q6600. Now, this CPU was launched at the beginning of 2007 for $850. Yeah, this was a 2.4 gigahertz, 4-core, 4-thread processor. At the time this came out, most people were buying Core 2 Duos, such as an 6400 or E6600 or something similar. And in fact, many people at the time were still buying Athlon X2s, although frankly, the Core 2s quickly ran away with the performance from the Athlon X2s. The Core 2s were faster. I actually owned an Athlon X2, which we won't get into. That'll be saved for maybe part 2 of this. But I did own an Athlon X2, and I did replace it with a Core 2 Duo the year previously in 2006 for a couple of reasons. I needed a second computer. My wife and I were recently married. Not terribly recently. Within the previous couple of years we were married, and we only had one computer, and so it gave us an excuse to have 2. I no longer have that computer, unfortunately. It was a Dell Xps in the medium white tower case, but I sold it a number of years ago because what was I going to do with a Core 2 Duo? Even today, what would I do with a Core 2 Duo? So I did sell that, but that was pretty cool. This was an office machine. This was never a personal computer that I used at home, and neither was this, by the way. In fact, the only computer on the desk here that was like a personal machine that I used at home to play games in my house was this big tower, which we'll get to in a minute. This was bought to replace a Core 2 Duo in my office. I had a Core 2 machine on my desk, and it was a Core 2 Duo, and I needed another machine for another employee. I had an office at the time with about 15 employees working for me. This is back when I did IT consulting, IT networking, that sort of stuff. And so I got a deal on this. I bought this from Dell, and of course, because it was the newest and fastest computer at the time, I get it because I'm the boss. And so I got this, and I took the machine that was on my desk, wiped it, reinstalled Windows XP, and put that wherever I needed at the time. I don't remember anymore who that went to or why. It's been a long time. So that's why I got this, was because I needed another computer, and so it was an opportunity to buy myself the newest and shiniest thing, and it was very nice. 2 extra cores, going from a 2-core to a 4-core. In 2007, that wasn't necessarily required. You didn't need a 4-core processor at the time, and the sort of stuff that I was doing with a computer, to be blunt, I didn't need it. I wanted it. And I was buying a computer anyway, so why not? But I've owned this since new, and that was in my office. What's interesting is about a year later, these came out. And I didn't buy one of these right away. I didn't actually buy this until early 2019. So I've personally had this for almost exactly 10 years at this point. 2009, excuse me. This came out in November of 2008. I bought it probably February or March 2009. And the same thing happened. This went onto my desk, and this went to one of my employees. Who, where, what, I don't know, but it ended up in the office somewhere. And I had a lot of computers back then. I mean, we must have had at least 15 plus computers in the office, most of which are long since sold by this point. In fact, we'll talk about why this is here and some other ones in a minute. But so this got moved somewhere else in the office, and I generally tended to do this. Every 6 months to a year, I'd just buy one of whatever the newest computer was and just sort of move the machines down the chain in the office because, well, why not, right? What's interesting about this is I did another upgrade at the same time. I had been running for many years on some 20-inch 4x3 LCD monitors that I had bought a couple years beforehand. They were Dell Ultra Sharps. They were very, very nice. I think they were 20-inch. Maybe they were 24-inch. I think they were 20-inch. Anyway, they were 4x3 ratio instead of 16:9 ratio. And I had 3 of those on my desk, but they were small, and it was time for something bigger and newer, and I needed more monitors for the office, and so I thought, well, okay, I'll do the same thing. We'll spread those monitors out throughout the office, and I'll get myself some new monitors. In 2007 and 2008, the big monitors at the time were not 4K monitors. The big ones were the 30-inch monitors. Now, Apple was first with their big cinema display, but then Dell had their 30-inch 2560 by 1600, not 1440, but essentially you'd call them 1440p monitors today, but they were 1600 because they were 16 by 10 ratio rather than 16 by 9. And so I got 3 of those. Yes, they were expensive. Yes, they were over $1,000 a piece. But I also worked on a lot of spreadsheets and Word documents and other stuff at the time. The nice thing about those 30-inch monitors is they're the perfect size to have 2 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper on screen in Microsoft Word in real size. Meaning if you held up 2 real pieces of paper to the monitor, they fit on the monitor in real size. And with 2560 by 1600 resolution, the resolution was good enough that you could see what you were doing and work on actual documents in full size. So in one monitor, I'd have, my email and web browsers and other stuff up, and then I'd have Word in another, and then maybe Excel or whatever else I was working on the third. I love multiple monitors. I've had multiple monitors now for a long, long time, multitasking, etc. One of the things that we did a lot of back then was proposals. And I would type up proposals, and there'd be like a spreadsheet that'd be dropped into Word, and I'd be laying everything out and basically creating a presentation, because that was a sales pitch. Now, of course, I talked to clients in person, and I would, of course, go in and give my pitch in person. But a lot of times you'd have to answer a request or fill out requests for proposal. Companies looking to spend money, they wanted us to come in and network 15 machines, 25 machines, 50 machines. We didn't do a lot of that. We did a lot of small ones until I got into consulting, where we got out of the hardware business. But essentially, we did just have some jobs where we'd go in and meet people cold, and they'd say, well, here's what we need to do. What's it going to take? And that's more personal one-on-one, where you just do it on the fly and say, well, let me take a look at what you've got so I can give you an intelligent answer. And we'd talk about it, and they'd give me a tour of the office, and I'd say, well, what do you want to accomplish? Because it's easy to say, well, man, these computers are 6 years old. We need to get you some new computers. And actually, one of the things I'd tell them is I'd say, look, before you just think you just need to spend a lot of money, what do you want to accomplish? You asked me here for a reason. What are you trying to do? Do you want the machines faster? Do you want them to talk to each other? Is Linda's computer in accounting not printing to the big printer in the hallway? What is it that you want to accomplish? Let's make sure that we accomplish everything you want to do, because when you write us a very large check and we walk out of here, then I want you to be happy, because two reasons. I want to come back and do it again for you in a couple of years, and we want to provide ongoing service, and I want you to tell all of your other business friends that we are the best, and you need to have them come out here. We weren't the cheapest. I never tried to be the cheapest, because what I discovered is that clients that only shopped on price were the most pain in the neck clients in the world, and they nickeled and dimed you for everything, and they complained about every last cent. The people who only care about price, especially in the business environment, can be very difficult to work with. So, unrelated note to all of these computers, but I thought I would just toss it out there. This is story time with tech. I do have some notes in front of me just based on dates and a few other things that I wrote down to sort of get myself familiar with what I wanted to talk about. But beyond that, it's just ramble with tech time. So in any case, I had 3 monitors. They were the very expensive, very large, the WFP 3007s we started off with, but those didn't have a built-in scaler, and I ended up replacing those about a year later with 3008s, which were much better monitors than the 3007s. Better color, better controls, just better all the way around. I sold the 3007s for close enough to what I paid for them. It was pretty close to a wash, so I wasn't worried about it. So that's what I used this for actually quite a few years. I used this until 2011, 2012, in my office as a work machine, as a daily driver. Yes, the second-gen chips had come out, the refresh chips of the first line had come out. In fact, it wasn't too far away from Ivy Bridge coming out, Sandy Bridge being second-gen, Ivy Bridge being third-gen. And so, but frankly, for what I was using a computer for Word documents and Excel at that time, I think it was Office 2007 that I was using. For Office 2007 on Windows XP, and then eventually upgrading to Windows 7 when it came out, we skipped Vista. In fact, actually, as I look on this has a Windows Vista sticker on it, but it never had Vista on it. This had XP on it. This was back during the time when nobody wanted Vista, and so they were doing downgrade rights. So they would ship the machines with XP installed. You had the option to go to Vista, but we skipped that. We went to Windows 7. So I use this because, frankly, for those tasks, you don't need the latest and greatest machine with the highest end hardware. And I actually went for a while there without buying a lot of new machines for the office. There were enough computers in the office that I just didn't need to upgrade. The majority of my office in 2011 still had, not this, but Core 2 Duos. They were Vostro 200s. The Vostro line back then was really, really nice. They were dependable, and they were the slim lines. They weren't big towers like this. I mean, for office machines, you don't need these. They were the ultra slim ones that you couldn't really put a graphics card or anything in. Using integrated graphics, most of my office machines had 2 monitors. Usually they were like 19-inch monitors. 1600 by 900, I think they were. I don't even think they were 1080p back then. And they were TN panels. Mine were always IPS, but most of the employees had TN panels because IPS panels back then did cost quite a bit more, and you could pick up the 19 TNs pretty cheap. So I think they were 1600 by 900 if memory serves. But most of the machines always had at least 2 monitors on them. Even normal office workers, people answering the phone, being able to have your email and your other work-related stuff on one screen, and then whatever you're working on the other is a productivity enhancer. If I can spend $150 and buy an extra monitor for each computer, and it makes them even 5% more productive, it's an interesting math equation, and I would take people through this, segueing back to the whole consulting and computer business stuff. The last thing a business owner wants to hear is, you want me to spend several thousand more dollars on X? You want me to spend $5,000 on Y? Oh man, that's not in the budget. You're crazy. How much do your employees cost? Oh man, talk to me about payroll. They're so expensive. Would you say that maybe your average office workers in here make between $30,000 to $50,000 a year? Yeah, whatever the number was immaterial, but it's going to be a lot more than the cost of the computers. What is 5% of their paycheck? I'll bet you it's a whole lot more. I'll bet you it's a whole lot more than $150 or $200 for a monitor, or $200 for a much nicer computer, or whatever it is that they need. It depends upon the goal. If you just have a front desk computer for the receptionist who simply answers the phone and answers emails, they don't need anything fancy. They could just have a very, very basic computer. But what's interesting is they might want a basic computer, but they might be the one who need 3 monitors, because they're actually sitting there and they've got the calendar or the schedule or whatever it is that they're doing. They've got that on one screen, they've got their email on the other screen, and then they've got their miscellaneous screen in the middle that they might be using for Word documents, or they might be using to pull up whatever. That's actually the person, ironically, who often needs the most monitors. The person in the back may not, except Janice in accounting. Janice might need 4 monitors. That's a separate conversation. One of the most valuable productivity things that we did was introduce the concept of multiple monitors. I've been a believer in multiple monitors for a long time, to a lot of companies that were like, why would you put more than 1 monitor on a computer? That's a great question. Glad you asked. So, in any case, I'm a believer in enhanced productivity, and if you can take somebody that you're paying $20 an hour and make them even 5% more productive, $150 for a monitor is trivial. Do it. Absolutely. If your employees are waiting for your computers, something's wrong. Same thing with SSDs. I was a very early adopter of SSDs 10 years ago, starting off with the original OCZ drives, which had varying degrees of reliability, and then moving into the Intel drives, especially the X25 G2 drives, which this still has one in it. This has a 160 gigabyte X25 G2 SSD in here. I bought that in 2010 from Newegg for $550. Yeah, compare that to the price of your SSDs today. Now, they did have a promo at the time. I've mentioned this in the past. If you bought the 160 gig drive for $550, you got the X25 V drive, the value drive, 40 gigabyte for free. And I still have that drive too. Both work perfectly, no issues. They are quite a bit slower than modern drives, but this still has the X25 G2 160 gig drive from 2010 in it. And once you've moved your office to SSDs, I mean, yeah, hard drives are fine. Again, productivity. Now, you don't have to put drives of that size. I had a bunch of the Kingston V30 or VNow drives back then. They were 30 gigabytes in size, but 30 gigabytes for Windows XP is absolutely plenty, and they were not too expensive at the time, especially when you buy 10 of them from a distributor. However, they were pretty bad. I got rid of those as soon as I could. The performance of some of the early SSDs was pretty bad. Today, It's hard to buy a bad SSD. I would skip the super cheap ones, but any of the major manufacturer SSDs are all great, and it really makes no difference whatsoever. Crucial MX500, ADATA SU800, Samsung 860 EVO, Western Digital Blue, the SanDisk Ultra 2, you will not be able to tell the difference between any of those drives in normal day-to-day use. I could swap them all, put up identical machines, they're all about the same. Buy whatever you either prefer in terms of brand or just whatever's cheapest at the time. It doesn't make a big difference. It did back then, but it doesn't today. So that's what happened with this. I bought this computer, then replaced it with this, upgraded the monitors, and then I used this for quite a few years because it was ahead of its time. The i7-920 really was ahead of its time, and even though its clock speed is not substantially higher, the Core 2 Quad Q6600 is a 4-core, 4-thread, 2.4 gigahertz processor. The i7-920 is a 4-core, 8-thread, 2.66 gigahertz processor. It does technically turbo to 2.933, although it really doesn't much, 2.8, but it's just slightly higher in clock speed than the Core 2 Quad. This Core 2 Quad does not have an integrated memory controller. AMD had gone to the integrated memory controller by putting the memory controller on the CPU before Intel did. And I remember reading a quote way back then basically saying, this is revolutionary, this is huge, this is wonderful. It's with AMD, it did provide them with a good performance jump, but you can only do it once. You can only integrate the memory. You get that nice speed boost because previously the memory controller was on the chipset. There's been a lot of evolution over the years in computers that have made them faster and better and feel faster and be more responsive and multitask better, etc. Moving the memory controller from the chipset to the CPU does provide a noticeable performance boost. How much so depends upon what you're doing, but it is a nice change. The i7-920 has the memory controller on the chip, the Core 2 Quad doesn't. But again, you can only do it once, because once it's on there, it's on there. That's sort of that great leap forward that you can only make once. However, there was another change that also made a difference. Most Core 2 Quads had DDR2. You could actually find them with DDR3. Some of the late models, especially the refresh, this is an original model, but some of the refresh models you could find with DDR3, but since the memory controller wasn't on the CPU, the benefit was limited and DDR3 was expensive back then, so that didn't really make a lot of sense. So DDR3 in here, and this actually has good, for its time, for when this machine was built, this has 9 gigabytes of DDR3 1333. That's impressive. The 1033, I believe it was, also existed, but this is 1333, and it is triple channel memory. This is dual channel. In fact, this is dual channel, and this is dual channel. Triple channel was a bit odd at the time. This was sort of a hybrid system that was kind of in between the high-end desktop concept that they were starting to work on and going towards, besides their server and workstation platform, of course. So this had triple channel memory, and the promise of the X58 chipset in here was that it was going to be future upgradable with triple channel memory. There'd be new CPUs you could install. None of that ever happened, of course. They ended up moving on to the LGA 1150, 1151, 1155 series sockets. So this kind of got orphaned really, really quickly. But the X58 chipset had a number of innovations in it, which made it substantially faster than the Core 2 line. At the time, running Windows XP and legacy software, the difference is less than it would be today. Running Windows 10, and I've run Windows XP on these, I've run Windows 7 on these, I've run Windows 8.1, and I've run Windows 10. The later in the operating system series you go, the bigger the difference between these two. And that's something I think that gets overlooked when you compare performance of new and old equipment. At the time something new and shiny launches, it isn't being fully developed for, all of its new instructions and capabilities aren't fully utilized, software's been optimized and designed for the previous hardware, and so your benefit, even if it is faster, is only going to be so much. Give it some time, and those features and benefits start to be utilized. For example, the i7-920 has instructions that the Core 2 Quad is missing. There's part of the extensions to the instruction set. So when it first came out, nothing was using it. It didn't matter. Today they are. The additional memory bandwidth. The memory bandwidth difference between these machines is tremendous. Maybe it didn't matter in Windows XP, but in Windows 10, it does. So if you're still running a Core 2 Duo or Core 2 Quad in 2019, and worse, you have Windows 10 on it, please, it's time to retire that thing. I actually still have Windows 10 on this, but I'm going to wipe it and reinstall Windows XP. This is going to become a long-term legacy Windows XP machine. I'll find something appropriate to put in here in terms of video card. I actually had a couple of video cards sent to me by viewers that I did in unboxings last year in 2018, one of which was, I believe it was an 8800 GTX. Maybe it was a GTS. It's on the shelf downstairs. I keep all that stuff. The stuff that everybody has sent me, I certainly appreciate it. That would actually be a pretty cool graphics card to put in here and make it a legacy computer. Offline, it's not going to access anything. It's not going to be used for anything. But it would provide me with a long-term Windows XP box where everything's supported and everything works properly and you don't have to mess with compatibility. This i7 is going to become my long-term Windows 7 box. Windows 7 runs beautifully on the i7-920. Now, as I mentioned in the home theater PC video, this is no longer secure. It has no Spectre fixes. The Intel management engine is ridiculously out of date. It has not received a BIOS update since 2011. This thing is horribly insecure at this point. And if you have an i7-920 and you access your email and your online banking on it, in my opinion, you're crazy. There's no way to make this computer secure. It is now inherently insecure. No patches to your operating system, no antivirus, nothing you do can actually make this machine secure. And the same thing is true of the Core 2 Quad, because these did not receive Spectre fixes, and the management engine that runs on the chipset for both of these machines is never going to be fixed. It's never going to be corrected for its flaws. The CPU, you can turn these off. If you plug these into the wall, they turn on. And the management engine, which runs on the chipset on the motherboard, is always running. It can turn the machine on and off. It can be remoted into. It has direct access to the hardware. Even when the operating system boots, the management engine on these two machines, in fact, on most recent Intel machines, the management engine is a video. We could make a whole video on that because I don't like how Intel's done that, but it's neither here nor there. We don't have a lot of say in the matter. AMD has the same thing, by the way. AMD has an internal management engine that runs that you can't turn off on their systems either. So these have code baked into the hardware that has not been securely updated or fixed, that has full access to all system memory, everything going in and out on the Ethernet port, and nothing Windows can do has any control over it. The CPU has no control over it, and it will never be fixed. These machines are not safe to use online anymore. So these will become legacy machines. This will be my Windows XP box. This will be my Windows 7 box for use offline, playing older games, or just sort of add to my collection. I mentioned the Apple IIe earlier in the video. I don't have that anymore. I'll tell you the story of that in the other video. I do still have my next computer, which is an Apple II GS. I have everything original, the software, the monitor, the drives. I even have my original Apple ImageWriter 2. One of these days I may do a retro video on it. It's not really my content and cup of tea. We'll see. But that's on my list somewhere. So, and I do have a Dell Pentium 4, which is a Windows 98 box. And I don't use it very often. In fact, frankly, it hasn't been on for over a year at this point. But I do have a Windows 98 second edition box that I've sort of kept as a collector's piece. What I'm missing is a DOS and Windows 3.1 box. And I will probably get a 486 DX4100 or 486 DX266 or something like that from the mid-90s, 93, 94 timeframe. To turn into a DOS and Windows 3.1. That sort of covers all the eras, at least that matter to me in any case. But we're segueing. Those are things we'll talk about in maybe part 3 or 4 of this video series, assuming you guys enjoy watching it. Where were we? Oh, yes. So that's what's happening with these machines. This computer eventually got replaced not with any of the computers you see on the desk here. And I didn't put it on the desk because I still have it, but the case that it is in is packed to the gills with gear and drives that are still in it, and it's heavy and it's downstairs. This filming room is actually on the second floor, and that thing must weigh 60 pounds. It is in an old Thermaltake full tower case that weighs 3 tons, and it's too heavy. I didn't want to carry it upstairs. I would actually need 2 people to carry it. It's so heavy. I'm going to tear it apart and take the motherboard and CPU out and put it in something else. If you've seen benchmarks on my channel with an i7-2600K, that's the computer. Still have it. I've owned it since new. In 2011, I built an i5-2500K. Now, I've since upgraded it to an i7-2600K. Get back to that in a second. But that's what replaced this machine. This became a secondary machine at that point. I still kept it. We used it sort of a second machine. My wife probably used it at one point. Then we eventually got kids and they used it for a bit until it became our media center PC. But we'll come back around to that. This got replaced with an i5-2500K. Of all the decisions that I've made in the past 10 years, that was the single biggest mistake that I ever made. I was penny wise and pound foolish. I bought the i5, I should have bought the i7. I was thinking to myself at the time, I don't really do that much multitasking. I run Office, I do images. I don't play that many games. I mean, I played some, but I wasn't like playing every latest and greatest game that was coming out every week. The clock speeds of the Sandy Bridge chips are noticeably higher than the first generation chips. I thought, well, the clock speeds are higher, it's overclockable, I'll set it to 4 gigahertz or 4.5, it's gonna be really, really fast. Who needs hyperthreading? i5-2500K, i7-2600K are both 4-core chips. The i7 is an 8-thread chip. What do I need to spend another $100, $150 just to get some extra threads, which aren't really cores? That's stupid. They're both unlocked. They can be set to the same speed. I'm going to save my money and buy an i5. Dumbest decision I ever made. I don't actually think most people should buy i5s. I think most people should buy i7s. I think that's where you can make an argument for the current i9, but they've kind of renamed everything. The old i3s are now 5s, the old i5s are now i7s, and the old i7s are now i9s, but that's just a marketing thing. I am building an i5 media center PC, but that is not a general purpose computer. That's a specialized machine, that's why. I would never build an i5 for my own use. I did it in 2011 and it was a mistake. And that mistake is why this exists. This was built in 2013. This is an i7-4770K, the first generation Haswell, not the refresh. 3.5 base, 3.9 turbo, 4 cores, 8 threads. This has an Asus Z87 Pro motherboard, very, very nice. Even still have the Wi-Fi adapter on it. I just had it back there to keep it out of the shop, but you can see it now that I've mentioned it. There is a Corsair H90 140 millimeter liquid cooler on this. It does overclock pretty nicely, not hugely so, but it does. It has 16 gigabytes of DDR3 I think it's 1600 megahertz RAM. I think it was 1600 megahertz RAM. I actually haven't had this on for several months. It might be 2400 at this point. Don't hold me to it. But in any case, it had 16 gigs of RAM, which was very nice at the time. And I built this with a Corsair HX 1050 power supply. There's a reason for that. Video card. But let's come back to that in a second and talk about the i5-2500K. If you try to save money and buy an intermediate processor, in my experience, and in part 2 and part 3, we may go back to the 90s and talk about the mistake of buying intermediate processors. My first 386, for example, was a 386 DX25. It should have been a 33. It wouldn't have been that much more expensive at the time. By the time you bought the entire computer, at the time it would have been a couple $100 more to make it a 33. It's a 50% higher clock speed for 10% of the price of the system. That would have been the biggest no-brainer decision in the history of no-brainers, but I didn't because that was a long time ago and I didn't know any better. So if you're buying yourself a general purpose personal computer, the more you buy, the longer it lasts. you sometimes pay a premium for it. But by buying an i7 or i9 or Ryzen 7 if you're buying AMD, you're buying yourself the future. This would not exist if I had just gone ahead and built a i7 2600K in 2011. In the 2 years that I used that machine as my daily driver, I was forever annoyed by the small stutters of the machine. I was forever annoyed by the drop from the 8 threads I was used to the 4 threads on the i5. It wasn't anything that I couldn't live with, but once you've had an i7, an i5 sucks. So, 2 years later, I repurposed that machine to something else and then built this beast of a computer and used this for quite a while, actually. Jumping to the end of this whole story, this was my daily driver when I started the YouTube channel in 2016. And I continued to use it until the end of 2016, or almost. If you've been watching my channel a while and you saw in 2016 the $4,000 Ultimate build, I'll link to that below if I remember to, the $4,000 Ultimate build with the i7 6800K Broadwell E, 6-core, 12 thread, I don't have enough fingers to show 12 threads, that is what replaced this. Now why? Is an i7 6800K 6-core chip dramatically faster in general desktop use than this i7 4770K? No. Is it faster in gaming? No. In fact, in some regards, it might be slower in gaming. Clock speeds are slower. Is it a nicer user experience just running Windows? No, it's not. I built that Broadwell E for one reason and one reason only: 4K video editing for this channel. This 4-core, 8-thread machine with its DDR3 system RAM, when trying to scrub and edit 4K video, was choppy. The CPU was slammed. It was just not a great experience. I'm going back and forth to the video files. And when you're working, especially with 2 different source files, when I like do build videos and stuff, 100 megabit per second files that you're trying to go through and edit and make titles and do stuff on, it was not a very good experience. When I built that i7 6800K Broadwell E machine, the experience of editing videos improved immediately. It was a noticeable and dramatic change, and it was so much nicer. I never regretted building that machine. Although a few months later, Ryzen would come out, but who knew at the time? Because it was, August or September of 2016 that I did that, and we didn't know about Ryzen at the time. There were rumors, but there was just rumors. You know, we had no idea how nice Ryzen was going to turn into. So that got replaced, but I used this probably longer than I've used most desktop computers, from 2013 to 2016, that's 3 years. This might have actually been used longer, but I bought this instead of building it. In terms of built computers, this has probably last longer than anything else. The Broadwell E machine didn't even last a year. That's remarkable how fast that got pushed out of the way by Ryzen. Ryzen lacks the high-end desktop features of Broadwell E. Dual channel memory, Broadwell E has quad channel memory, fewer PCI Express lanes, but 8 cores. Back in March of 2017, when Ryzen launched, I built a Ryzen 7 1700 for the channel. That build videos on the channel. I've built a number of them since then. So I started playing around with it because I had to get some practical user experience with the machine. I can't just throw it on the test bench and run a few benchmarks, put together some charts and say, oh, here's the new CPU, let me announce it. Well, I can, and too many people do this. I don't want to get into benchmarking and my opinions of benchmarking and hardware testing at this point, but suffice it to say, there's testing and then there's using. And I wanted to use it. So I built that machine, I filmed it, I did the whole 9 yards, and then I installed Adobe Creative Cloud, which is what I use, Adobe Creative Suite for my YouTube channel. And then I started using it. I started editing videos, I started browsing the web, I started rendering videos. Here's what's interesting. The Ryzen 7 1700 at that time did not render videos any faster than the 6-core Broadwell E did. It does today, but it didn't then. There was no optimization for Ryzen whatsoever when Ryzen first came out, and Adobe back then was not very optimized for multi-core use. It's much better today. Adobe really actually has done a lot of updates to make it much more multi-core, multi-thread friendly, which it certainly wasn't 2 years ago. Amazingly enough, I'm filming this in February of 2019, at the end of February. We're only like 2 or 3 weeks away from the 2nd anniversary of Ryzen's launch. So much has changed, and kudos to AMD for coming out with an amazing CPU that really has given Intel a run for its money. How many of you think that we would have gotten an 8-core, 16-thread consumer desktop processor that runs at 5 gigahertz, the i9-9900K, if it hadn't been for Ryzen? Raise your hands. Anybody? Anybody? Bueller? Bueller? Nobody? Oh, okay. Yeah, I agree with you. They wouldn't have. So that's neither here nor there. Of course, we skipped over this machine. We'll come back to it. i5-2500K. I don't have that CPU anymore. I sold that CPU because 2 years ago, just after I started my YouTube channel, I realized that I was going to want each of the i7 generations. And so what I did is I went onto eBay and I bought an i7-2600K for, I think I paid $150 for it, but I could be wrong. This was almost 2 years ago, sometime in 2017, I think. It might have been almost exactly 2 years ago at this point. I don't remember. In any case, I bought an i7-2600K off of eBay and put it onto that machine. That particular machine has an Asus Z86, not 86, 68, excuse me. I'm doing that from memory. A Z68 motherboard. And I don't remember the specific model. If I do any further coverage of it, or if I show the rebuilding of it into a modern case, because the Thermaltake case it's in is absolutely terrible, I'll do a video or I'll show it in something. I just didn't want to put it on the desk because it weighs too much and I want to carry it upstairs and hurt my back. I'm in my 40s now, so I'm being more careful about what I lift. In my 20s, I pick up anything, I didn't care, but it's as you get older, as the mileage kicks up on you, you start to be a little bit more careful about, the 50-pound items you pick up by yourself. Here's a fun thought. If you actually listen to all of my videos and look at the history of it and look at the early videos, you'll notice something in common. It's all Asus. I actually have another i7-920. And most of the benchmarks you've seen on my channel with an i7-920, not all, but most, were on my other i7-920, which was my personal machine before the... I'm kind of going around in circles here. I realize I kind of skipped over this earlier because this isn't scripted and this isn't teleprompted. I mean, I have some notes in front of me, but this is story time with tech. I'm just rambling off the top of my head. This was my office machine. My personal machine was that Dell that I told you about in the white mini tower, the Dell XPS, that had a Core 2 Duo E6600, 2.4 gigahertz, but 2 cores instead of 4. And then I bought a i7-920 from iBuyPower. And I still have that. In fact, the case even still says iBuyPower on the front of it. That came in a mid-tower case, and that has an Asus P6T motherboard. That overclocks very nicely. You can't overclock this because it's a Dell, obviously. They don't allow you to overclock these. But that overclocks very, very nicely. And that's useful for comparisons. And I've done some videos in the past with i7-920s, and most of those were in that rather than this because that's overclockable. Even with the Intel stock cooler. Intel used to make good stock coolers. That has an Intel stock cooler on it, but it's a real copper core. Think Wraith Spire with the actual copper core on the bottom and a decently large fan. The stuff that Intel sells today for stock coolers is garbage, but they used to actually sell good stock coolers. And so that replaced my Core 2 Duo as my personal machine at home. I just went to look to go see if I could figure out when exactly I bought that, because I know it was after this, and my records don't go back that far. I had a quick look and I couldn't find it. What's interesting is that at some point, my work machine and my home machine kind of merged into one. This ultimately became both my work and my home machine. Back around 2007 to about 2011, I had separate work and home machines, and then eventually they became one. Interestingly, I put my most powerful machine for work use, and then ultimately, I got out of gaming for a while. The only game I was playing from about 2011 till about 2014 was Star Wars: The Old Republic, the online massively multiplayer role-playing game. I was very active in it, but it didn't require an overpowered machine, and so that was all I was playing at the time. There's a lot of games in that era specifically that I didn't play at the time. I was too busy with work and raising kids. My youngest son was born in 2010, and so as you can imagine, with a 1-year-old son at home and then 2 older kids, there really wasn't a lot of time for that sort of things. Those of you with kids know what I'm talking about. So I went to go look to see what happened with that, but I can't actually see when I must have been around 2009. It might have been 2010 when I bought that. I don't remember at this point. I can't find a record for it. So I still have those. And I'm still going to keep those for benchmarking purposes for a little while longer. But the Asus P16 motherboard, which is really nice, and ironically is the most valuable thing in there. An i7-920 CPU isn't worth very much. You can find those for 20 bucks. The motherboard, on the other hand, at least in the United States, those are pretty valuable, mostly because people want to install a X5875 Xeon CPU, which will work in those boards. It won't work in this, but it'll work in the Asus board. And those have 6 cores, 12 threads, and will overclock to 4 gigahertz with an appropriate cooler. And those CPUs are nearly 9 years old. What, 9? Yeah, they are 9 years old at this point. Intel had a 6-core, 12-thread CPU nearly a decade ago that would install in an X58 motherboard. Why did it take until recently for us to get better CPUs? Oh, gee, I don't know. Competition from AMD? How's that for blunt honesty? Intel, I love you, but come on, you were slacking for several years there. So that's neither here nor there. This beast right here, I was using actively when I started the channel, and then I went to the I went to the Broadwell E, and then in 2017 I went to the Ryzen 7, and then last year built the what's it like? Oh my goodness, it was over a year ago. It was the end of 2017 Skylake X, which is actually still downstairs and in active use. In fact, as I'm recording this video, my wife is downstairs editing a headset video. She's got a whole bunch of headsets that she filmed. She's used them all. The kids have used them all. We plugged them into both desktops and laptops. She recorded some audio samples on them. She actually spent about 2 weeks using all of the headsets, and basically that I mentioned before, testing versus benchmarking. With Ryzen, you know what occurs to me? I could really use a script for these things. I might at some point actually start scripting my videos. I was talking before about the difference between testing and using. Ryzen 7 is not a high-end desktop platform like Broadwell E is. But as soon as I started editing videos on an 8-core processor, even though it didn't render videos any faster, the 8-core 16 threads, even though it didn't have quad-channel RAM, it was smoother than the Broadwell E when I was working with video, especially when there was more than one video in the timeline and you're scrubbing through the timeline and putting edits, transitions, cuts, words on the screen, etc. I very quickly, like immediately, replaced the Broadwell E with the Ryzen 7, and I used that until it got replaced with the Skylake X. Interestingly enough, the 8-core Skylake X that my wife is downstairs using at the moment, that is also an 8-core 16-thread chip. It's the i7-7820X, 8-core 16-thread chip. I do have an i9-7900X, but it's on my test bench. I've shown that in previous. In fact, in my other house, it was behind me a lot of times. When you saw the black test bench behind me over in the corner, that has a Gigabyte X299 board and the i9-7900X 10-core 20-thread processor. So my main work machine is an 8-core 16-thread chip. That renders video 25% faster than the Ryzen 7 does for a bunch more money. But it is smoother and faster and has more PCI Express lanes, and I have multiple NVMe drives in there and quad-channel RAM, and it was a better platform than Ryzen 7. And would I have necessarily run out and spent a bunch of money to upgrade from Ryzen 7 to Skylake X for what I'm doing? No. MSI sent me the motherboard, Intel sent me the CPU, so why the heck not? You know, if they're going to send me this stuff, I might as well use it. It is faster. Now, if I didn't already own Ryzen, would I have bought Skylake X? I answered this in those videos, actually. Yes, I would have bought Skylake X. But I wouldn't upgrade to it. And I think that's an example of a distinction. I will get back to the usability versus benchmarking. That's a distinction that I think gets lost. In these video reviews and even web page reviews and forums and Reddit, when people talk about this stuff, They don't make a distinction between should I upgrade to that or should I buy that new. If you own a Ryzen 7 and you do content creation and you're not like a big channel making daily videos and it's like serious 4K video work, keep your Ryzen 7. It's great value for the money. I wouldn't replace it for anything. Not Threadripper, not Skylake X, nothing. If you currently own an i5 or a Ryzen 3 or maybe a Ryzen 5, is Skylake X or Threadripper worth upgrading to? Yes, I think it may be. So there's a distinction between whether or not the high-end platforms or the more expensive platform is worth it, depending upon what you're coming from. I would never have replaced a Ryzen 7 1700 with an i7-7820X. Going from 8 cores, 16 threads to 8 cores, 16 threads, okay, the clock speed's higher, the instructions per clock cycle were higher, it was high-end desktop, quad-channel RAM, more PCI Express lanes, but for what that would have cost to buy, that's ridiculous. That would be a horrible deal. However, if I was still on this i7-4770K and I had not gone to Broadwell E and I had not gotten a Ryzen, then Skylake X would have made total sense. In fact, the only reason I used Ryzen is because my Broadwell E was 6 cores. If I'd had the 8-core Broadwell E, which was like $1,000 at the time, which was ridiculous, if I'd had the 8-core Broadwell E, I wouldn't have needed the upgraded to Ryzen. I wouldn't have bothered with the Skylake X. None of it would have been really worth the trouble. It would have been fine. I did a series of videos in 2016. And for those of you who were around back then who are watching this today, thank you. And if you weren't, maybe go watch them. They'll hopefully be linked down in the description below. I did a video titled i7-6700K versus i7-6800K. It's very early in my channel. I didn't have a lot of fancy benchmarks and recorded videos and a lot of fancy stuff to show you. But at the time, I did a price analysis. I did put the words on the screen, and at the time what I said was, for about $150-ish more, a little bit more for the motherboard, a little bit more for the CPU, because it's like $430 for an 6800K versus $350 for a 6700K. So it's like $70 more for that and $70 more for the motherboard for $150 more. For $150 more, you get 6 cores, 12 threads, as opposed to 4 cores and 8 threads. It's future-proofing. It gives you something better for the future. As it turned out, that Broadwell E is roughly the same performance as a Ryzen 5 1600, 1600X perhaps. Had you gone ahead and done that, you had some insulation towards the future. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that the 8-core chip for $1,000 was worth it. $600 more for 2 more cores is stupid, but that's neither here nor there. The 6-core chip was the deal. You could have skipped all of Ryzen, and unless you're a serious content creator, you could still be running that Broadwell E machine today and you'd be fine. You could have skipped Ryzen, Skylake X, you could have skipped the i7-8700K. Now the 8700K Coffee Lake 6-core 12-thread is faster than Broadwell E. Do you care? Are you playing at 144 frames per second? If you are, then yes, it's probably worth it. If you're not, if you're only playing it up to 100 frames per second, Broadwell E is all that you need. And you've skipped all the previous several years upgrades and you're still sitting pretty for perhaps several more years. If in 2016 you followed my advice and built a Broadwell E and you're only looking for gaming up to 100 frames per second, not 144, which I would recommend higher clock speeds, you don't need an upgrade. Keep it. You're going to get 5+ years of value out of that machine, if not more, without any complaints whatsoever. The only complaint I would personally have is that the prices on the CPUs haven't come down for the X99 motherboards, and you can't put a Skylake X chip in it because they changed the socket approval design, whatever, even though they're basically the same thing between Broadwell E and Skylake X, which sucks because if you could drop a 10-core chip into that existing machine, that would be an epic value. In fact, I would do that if I could, but the 8 and the 10-core Broadwell E chips are stupid expensive. Even used on eBay, they're stupid expensive, so they're not worth it. My wife's computer at home that she streams to, or did stream, we kind of taken a break from Twitch at the moment, the computer at home that she has done all of her Twitch streaming on for the past 6 months is the Broadwell E. And it does a great job. No complaints. no issues. So I try to repurpose machines. Yes, I have a lot of computers, but before I had a YouTube channel, I had an IT consulting business, and before that I had a computer networking business where we actually sold, installed, and set up and supported networks for small to medium-sized businesses. I always said small to medium-sized. The reality is they were always small. 50 machines was a big and rare installation for us. 25 was the most common. That's a small business. But small to medium sounds much more, but it's all marketing, what can I say? Small to medium businesses sounds more impressive than small businesses. And also when you say that to potential clients, that lets them in their mind go, oh, I'm the medium business. No, you're a small business, you have 30 employees, you're a small company. But it strokes their ego, so I'm being honest, what can I say? This is the kind of thing you can say to people after you have their business and you've made them happy. Where was I? Testing versus, well, we'll wrap this up here in a minute. I haven't talked about this yet though, that's interesting. We'll get back to that. Testing versus benchmarking. Anybody can take a new CPU, a new graphics card, they can throw it on a test bench, they can build a machine, they can run benchmarks, they can produce charts, and they can say, this new configuration ran Blender at 4 minutes and 27 seconds and it was 20% faster than this machine. Or this computer runs Crisis at X number of frames per second, which is faster than that machine in that configuration. Anybody can do that. That's not hard. You can do that. The more interesting thing that I've tried to focus on in the history of my channel is, here's my experience using it. Here's what I think based upon real world use. If you've watched my memory and my SSD and other videos, some of those are not filled with endless benchmarks. You can go to websites and find page after page. An Antec, for example, if you look at some of their storage reviews, they'll have like 9 pages of benchmarks. I'm not knocking an Antec, it's a good website, but it's a lot of technical detail that doesn't always actually answer the question, should you buy this? Is this worth the money? Is it really faster than something else? Is it better for you? Or is it just good for elite super users? Or what is the point of this? A good example is Nvme versus Sata. I personally prefer Nvme. I can tell the difference in heavy workloads because I've got all of them. And when you use stuff side by side, day in and day out, you very quickly get to the point to where you can usually just feel the difference between different pieces or different levels of equipment because you've run them and tested them and played with them enough. Most normal people, which look what used to be my main machine. I've been a normal person. I've just been a person with just a computer on my desk and monitors, and I just used it. And the particulars and what motherboard it has and what brand of RAM it has, I couldn't have cared less. Did it run my programs and was it fast and responsive? Yes, then let me move on and get my work done. So I've been there. I know what a normie is. Sometimes I've been a normie. Sometimes I've been I like to build a liquid-cooled, overclocked, fancy beast in a huge full tower case because it's fun. I've done it both ways. When I used Ryzen, I spent like 2 weeks playing with it, using it, running programs, editing videos, so that when I started to make videos on it, I didn't look at the camera and all of you sitting there on the other side of YouTube and say, well, I tested this and it ran these programs and it took 4 minutes to render my test video footage and I played these games and here was the frame rate and I built the computer and here's the price of it and yeah, it's an impressive new processor from AMD. Go Team Red. Yeah, you can do that. What have you learned? Some numbers? Unless you really study this, the numbers take some experience to interpret. Do those high FPS matter? I've mentioned many times, if you want high frame rates, buy Intel. If you're okay with up to 100 frames per second, there's no reason to buy Intel. At any resolution, 1080p, 1440p, or 4K, any games, if you want to play games between 60 to 100 frames per second, Ryzen does a great job. Intel is faster. But if you're not playing at high frame rates or you don't care about high frame rates, you don't have a high frame rate monitor, if you're not a competitive player, if you're looking for value for the money, who cares? Ryzen's spectacular. I have preached the virtue of Ryzen since day one, and I said back in March of 2017 that it was the most important CPU launch in 10 years. And it was. since this thing. It really was. However, I'm really liking the i9-9900K 8-core 16-thread 5 GHz processor. It is faster than Ryzen. How much so? It depends greatly on what you're doing. Sometimes it's a little bit faster, sometimes it's medium, and sometimes it's monstrously faster. Here's some general advice. If you're spending $2,000 on your computer, buy an i9. If you're spending $1,000, buy a Ryzen 7. Somewhere in the middle, it's a big fat maybe, and it depends. The more you spend on your computer, the more logic it makes to put into the i9. The i9 has more headroom for future performance with better graphics cards and fancier programs. It has more for the future, but it costs more, a couple $100. The $200 price difference between Ryzen 7 2700X and the i9-9900K is a lot of money on a $1,000 or $1,200 build. It's no big deal on a $2,000 build. I hold that if you've got $2,000 for a Ryzen 7, you've got $2,200 for an i9. And if you don't, then you're probably building more computer than you should. You should be building like a $1,200 machine and putting the rest of your money in the bank, or not charging it to Visa or MasterCard if you don't have the money in the first place. But that's dad advice. I'll put that aside for the moment. You know, as I sit here looking at this machine, I love this. This was my daily driver for 3 years. It's such a nice machine. It's, you know what? I'm going to take the side off and turn it towards the camera. Before we do that, I'm going to show you the side of this. The cable management's not great. Don't laugh at my cable management because it didn't care and it doesn't matter. I got a lot of flack from people when I built the Broadwell E machine. I do better with cable management now because of that. But my Broadwell E that I built on the channel has no attempt at cable management whatsoever. And I got a lot of flack from people at the time. Oh my God, your cable management's terrible. How could you possibly build a $4,000 computer and have crap cable management? It's a full tower case with 5 fans. It doesn't care. It's never made a difference. It's not as pretty as it could be. But in large cases like this, it doesn't matter. If you were to build the same machine in a case this size, then it matters. But it doesn't in something this size. Anyway, putting that aside, what is this? You've seen this on the channel in the past. This is a Dell Optiplex i5 4035. I opened it up to be absolutely sure because I have a couple of these. This is an i5 3450, 4-core, 4-thread, 3rd generation Ivy Bridge system. Notice the changed power supply? I think there's a video on my channel somewhere showing that power supply being changed out. I've done a number of benchmarks in this particular machine. You can buy these for $100 on eBay depending upon the configuration. Throw a power supply in, throw some RAM in there, throw a video card in there, you've got a nice gaming machine. You shouldn't, but you can. I've done videos on that deal. There's several videos that actually have quite a few views on my channel of i5 2400s, 3450s, 4440s. Don't. I wouldn't at this point buy any of them. They're not secure, and they'll never be secure again. Yes, this machine has a patch for Spectre. You can get Spectre patches for the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th generation machines. The problem is the Intel management engine on the chipset is never getting updated again, and they're out of date at this point, and they're not secure, and they will just become even more insecure over time. Furthermore, especially 3rd generation and older, these are missing a number of the instructions. They're missing AVX instructions, AVX2 especially. They didn't matter a couple years ago, but they're starting to matter now. So the instruction set on the CPU is not the same between this and the newer ones. The integrated graphics, definitely, if you're not putting a graphics card in, this does not have accelerated decoding for YouTube video, for example. So if you use the integrated graphics, it will accelerate and decelerate. The quick sync on the integrated graphics will do H.264, but not the VP9 that YouTube uses these days. So unless YouTube is feeding you an old video that they might... Does YouTube even do H.264 anymore? I might have to test that. But most of it's VP9, which interestingly enough, the only Intel integrated graphics that does VP9 hardware acceleration so your CPU isn't taxed, Kaby Lake, 7th gen. Not even Skylake does it. Kaby Lake and Coffee Lake both accelerated. Now, if you have a dedicated graphics card, if you drop a GTX 1050 or 1060 in here, for example, it doesn't matter because the graphics card has built-in hardware acceleration, deceleration, or encoding and decoding support, so it makes no difference whatsoever. Let me get this off the desk and show you that. Wait, nope, before we do that, this is an example of an office machine. These are the sorts of computers that I tended to have in my office and have most of my employees using. Some of these I bought new, some of these I bought refurbished. I bought a bunch of stuff from the Dell outlet. Most of the Dell Vostro 200 Core 2 Duos, and then some of the early Optiplexes, especially I must have had 4 or 5 i5-2400s that were all Dell Optiplexes in my office at one point, all bought through the Dell small business outlet. They were refurbished machines, basically returned or serviced or whatnot, and they were so cheap back then. Dell, they don't do the deals they used to, unfortunately. You know, they went private, their stock went private, and then I guess they're going public again, whatever. But back then, they were selling those. They were so, $200, $300 for a machine without a monitor. Throw another $100 for a refurbished monitor on there. You could outfit a whole office for a frighteningly reasonable price, which is why at some point I stopped doing that. I mentioned before we used to install and service networks, and then I moved into consulting. At the prices in the late 2000s that Dell was charging, I could never build machines for what Dell was selling them for. And so I eventually got to the point to where I charged for my time and for the service and support. And I told people, look, just go buy a dozen Dells. They're so cheap. In fact, if you need 12, go buy 14 of them. Take 2 spares, throw them in the closet. That way you have identical machines that we can pull out and have you up and running in 30 minutes if need be. They started selling these things so cheap that it just made no sense to keep building them. And so I stopped building them for a while. In fact, even my own machines for a while were Dells because these things were they were incredible values back then. Anyway, let me get this off the desk and put this over here. Well, there you have it, my nice messy cable management of my i7-4770K. I don't think I've ever shown the inside of this on the channel before. I've mentioned it, I think I've put it on the desk to show the outside of it, but I think this is the first time I have ever showed the inside of this computer. Now it has a GTX 1070 in there, which is, of course, it never had when it was actually in daily use because they didn't exist. I was trying to think what video card I built with this back in 2013 when I built this machine. I don't remember, to be completely honest with you. I really don't remember. Now, notice it has a 1050 watt power supply. Why? Once upon a time, I had an AMD R9 295X2. That's the dual GPU liquid-cooled card that was originally $1,500. Yeah, the prices dropped pretty quickly after that. In fact, about 9 months, a year after they first came out, you could find them online for $600, $700, give or take. They came in a metal case. They were very fancy, very nice. The problem is Crossfire sucked. It still sucks. It was worse back then, though, because of frame pacing. It was very stuttery, very uneven. And so while in certain games that supported it, it was very, very fast, it just wasn't a good overall experience. I ended up replacing that card. I know that was in here at one point because I replaced that R95, the R295, let me get it right, R9 295X2. That is a horrible product name. I replaced it with a GTX 980 Ti, which I still own to this day. That's in my son's computer, the i7-7700K. You've seen that on the channel several times. The old CyberPower machine, we upgraded it. It came with an RX 480, but that's in there because reasons which aren't important right now. But I ended up replacing it with a 980 Ti, which is not as fast as a 295X2 when Crossfire is properly supported. But it is faster when you're only using one of them, because an R9 295X2 is really 2 R9 290Xs on the same card in Crossfire. And that was just a horrible experience. So that got replaced, and it was a better overall experience. That drove the 3 Dell 30-inch monitors, which I still owned, by the way. I mentioned those on here. I kept those a long time. Those were not replaced until 3 years ago. 2016 When I built the Broadwell E and realized that I was going to be serious about making 4K video for YouTube, it was time to replace them. And I've done videos on them. I've shown them to you in the past. 32-inch Acer 4K monitors is what I use now. In fact, most of my work machines, both my machine and my wife, her machine has those 32-inch 4K monitors. I've long since sold all the Dell 30-inch monitors. I don't own those anymore. Here's what's mind-blowing. I got like $600 or $700 a piece for them. I got 50% of what I originally paid for them. 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. 8 years later. 8 years later. Mind-blowing. Absolutely. I was shocked at what I sold them for. And then the Acer 4K 32-inch monitors. Now, my only complaint is it went from 1610 to 16:9, so the 30-inch Dells were actually a little bit bigger in terms of surface area than the 32-inch Acers, because the more square you go, the more square inches you go. So 16:9s are smaller, so those 32s really aren't bigger. They might be a little bit smaller than the 30s. So that GTX 980 Ti drove 3 Dell 30-inch panels. Great for MMOs, playing Star Wars: The Old Republic on 3 30-inch panels. Holy smokes, because that game supported it. First, Eyefinity with the AMD cards, although Crossfire never worked properly in Star Wars: The Old Republic. And then NVIDIA Surround on the GTX 980 Ti. You can put your map on the left screen, you can put your inventory, and you can put your chat. Well, actually, the map was on the right screen. You can put your chat and inventory and other stuff on the left, and your entire front screen is just combat. And you can clear up all of the clutter. Especially in operations and PvP, you get nearly a 180-degree view with 3 monitors. It's probably not fair, actually, but it was a real tactical advantage. There was Terror from Beyond. Terror from Beyond is one of the operations, and Operator Zero is one of the bosses within Terror from Beyond, and it accesses the cores. Basically, several of your people have to go around and unlock the cores. They're shielded, and then the rest of you have to attack it. You could stand in one place in the room and see basically half the room. You could see this core, and that core with 3 monitors. You couldn't with 1. And so one thing I noticed very quickly is that my response time and the ability to respond to spawning enemies and to which core you had to attack is quicker because you can see everything at the same time. In PvP, standing in a corner or defending the doors of Void Star, for example, the PvP map, when you have 3 monitors and you're standing by, you're in defending mode, you're standing by the door, you can actually see way more than you otherwise could. The Alderaan one with the 3 guns that shoot at the spaceships, for example, your field of view is just so much bigger. It's a huge combat advantage. I'm surprised they let you do it considering that, but I doubt very many people do, so they probably don't worry about it too much. In any case, so that's what was in there. And actually, this still had the 980 Ti up until I think the point that I retired it. But that's why it originally had the big power supply, is because the R9 295X2 was like a 500 to 600 watt graphics card. And so, you want some margin for that. You could see the RAM right there. I don't remember what kind of RAM that is. Actually, I could pull one up. Kingston HyperX Beast KHX24C 11. Is this 32 gigs of RAM? 1.65 volts assembled in Taiwan. That's hilarious. That is, did I have 32 gigs of RAM in here? No. Maybe I did. I'll put that down there and put that back in later. That needs a good dusting. These drive trays, by the way, I actually used to have a bunch of drives in there. I had 4 terabyte drives for storage, and I've long since outgrown that. Those drives, it's interesting. I didn't think about that until just now. On the video showing the home theater PC and the replacement of this, in the home theater PC, I'm going to be putting in 4 terabyte Seagate 5900 RPM drives. This is where they came out of. I just remembered this is where they were at. And I had used those. I don't know if they were original to the machine. I might have added them later. I really don't remember at this point. It's been too long. But they were in here. And in fact, The cabling is still here. Some of these SATA cables right here, some of those SATA cables are still there, so interesting. If seeing this stuff is interesting, let me know. Maybe I'll get the old i7-2600K and i7-920, not this one, but the one with the Asus motherboard from iBuyPower out. Both of those are in Thermaltake cases. Both of them weigh a ton. I don't really want to carry them upstairs. You'll have to let me know. The last thing I want to say is need versus want is an interesting topic which probably could have its own highlighted video with its own title. I've had a lot of computers in my life that I wanted. I didn't need them, I wanted them. And when you're trying to figure out what to buy or build for yourself, keep that thought in mind. How much money do you have and what do you want? Because the more computer you buy, the nicer overall experience you're gonna have. The faster it's gonna be and the longer you're gonna be able to keep it, but it costs more money. Do you have that money? Spending it now just means you're gonna spend money further in the future, unless you just wanna keep up with the Joneses and always have the latest, greatest fancy thing. But if you buy middle of the road, you may find yourself upgrading sooner and saving far less than you thought, and then having to go through the transaction cost of either selling what you've got or otherwise disposing of it. So all the regrets that I have in my life, I mentioned earlier in the video, the 386 DX25 should have been a 33. The price difference at the time would have been like a 10% increase in the system cost for like a 50% clock speed increase, going from 25 to 33. That's about a 50% clock speed increase. I should have done that. 2 years later, I had to replace it with a 46 DX266, and that machine was overkill at the time. That was summer of '93. That was expensive. That was expensive at the time, but that lasted me for a while. That was a really, really nice upgrade, going from a 25 megahertz 386 to a 66 megahertz 486, just 2 years later. But I possibly could have put that upgrade off a year, and so the couple $100 spent on a 33 megahertz 386 might have paid back even more by putting off that upgrade for a year, because a year later in '94, a 46 DX266 might have well have been $500 less. So sometimes spending more money up front actually saves you money in the long run, or just actually doesn't cost you any extra because it improves the longevity of whatever you're using. An interesting example of that is the card that used to be in here, the GTX 980 Ti. When it came out, it was what, $700? Similar to an RTX 2080 today? That's a lot of money. So's an $1,100 RTX 2080 Ti. But a GTX 980 Ti today is still a solid gaming graphics card, even at 1440p, which is what it also would have been used at launch. Not as good as it was back then, but it's still a solid card. If you have a 980 Ti, you may have several more years to wait to upgrade. You may not even need one of the current RTX 20 series. You could wait till the 30 series. Had you saved money and bought a GTX 960 or 970, you might be itching for an upgrade, especially at 1440p. A 960 definitely. A 970 you could still get away. A 970 is still a good 1080p gaming card. But if you're the kind of person that wants a premium gaming experience, a 980 Ti still cuts it, but a 970 may not. You can spend $500 today and buy an RTX 2070. Or you can spend $1,100 today buying an RTX 2080 Ti. The 2080 Ti is not double the performance. It's close. It's about 80% faster. But if that $600 means that you get 6 years out of it, whereas the 2070 would only give you 3 years, it doesn't cost you any extra. It probably won't really work that way. It'll probably work. You could get maybe 3.5 years, maybe 3 years out of the 2070 and maybe 5 years out of the 2080 Ti. You're paying a bit of a premium, but you get epic performance today, and you get more VRAM, and you don't have to worry about it. It is a bit more. The 2080 Ti is quite expensive. That's a hard sell. If it was $800, it'd be an easy decision, but $1,100, it's a hard sell. The only reason this got replaced was because 4K video editing for YouTube. In 2016, when I built the Broadwell E, this was still fine. This played all the current games on the market in 2016. This had no issues whatsoever. Even today, this still plays games just fine. You want to play Ghost Recon Wildlands? Hang on, let's see here. GTX 980 Ti, 1440p, Ghost Recon Wildlands, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, all the latest AAA games. This would still do it with that card. This machine is 5.5 years old now, almost 6 years old, and it still keeps up pretty well. It's not as smooth, it's not as nice as the latest and greatest, but it is pretty nice. If this had been an i5 instead of an i7, no way, not even close. And that's exactly the problem that I had when I did the i5 2500K, the 4-cores, 4 threads. I very quickly discovered, oh, that's why you buy an i7. It's more responsive, it's smoother, it's nicer, and it just, that was a big mistake. So if you are building or buying a new machine, buy as much as you can afford. You will get a nicer experience that will last longer. If you want it, that is. What do you need? Well, let's be honest. If you just need access to email and editing Word documents, a Core 2 Quad will do that just fine, and these are stupid cheap. It's not secure, but it will do it. Everything beyond that is just one. I think that pretty much kills story time. I hope you guys have had a whole lot of fun with me. This has just been a long rambling video, and it's an experiment to see whether or not this sort of format is interesting to all of you. I'm not going to be making one of these every week, but maybe one a month. If this gets viewed, if this gets interest, if you like this, please share it with your friends, leave comments down below, hit like. I will read all the comments. I can't promise to respond to every one of them. Maybe you can leave your computer story. What have you owned over the past 10 years? That I'll be interested in reading down below. What systems did you buy? Did you own? Did you have any big regrets? Did you have any big wins and successes? Did you maybe buy the right deal at the right time? Did you get in early? Maybe you owned one of the Bulldozer FX chips. I have one of those now. I built it exclusively for the YouTube channel. That video is on the channel, FX8300. I still have it. I'm going to save it for benchmarking. It's probably time to pull it back out and run it through a series of tests, but I only did that for the channel. I never owned, after the Athlon X2s, I never owned anything AMD until the YouTube channel, because frankly, if you wanted the best, it was Intel. And other than a brief period of time in the early 2000s with the Athlons, that's always been true, not counting the 386 DX40s, the 46 DX4 133s, which they called P75s, which really weren't, and a few other chips that AMD did that were higher clock speed versions back in the 286, 386, and 40s. Except for those, Ryzen's interesting. And it is entirely possible that this summer, when Zen 2 or Ryzen 3rd Gen comes out, if they genuinely introduce, we don't know yet, but probably, 12 and 16 core desktop chips, that's going to be interesting on 7 nanometer. That'll be interesting to see what Intel's response to that is. I'm looking forward to it. I don't know about all of you. I genuinely love this stuff. It is my passion. It's why I do this. I'm not just testing this to make some YouTube videos and get some views and clicks. I mean, it's obviously I want to make a living at it because I do this for a living. I genuinely am passionate about technology and I love this stuff. So put your thoughts, history, comment, what you bought, what you regretted buying, what you wish you'd bought, deals you got, deals you missed. Put that down in the description below. Check the links to the other older videos down below if you're interested in taking a gander at those. I would certainly appreciate it. And then be sure to follow me on Twitter if you'd like tweeting updates down in the video description below. Thank you all so much for watching this ridiculously long story time video into tech's computer past. I look forward to seeing all of you next time.